How do analytics and technology intersect and mutually reinforce one another? What can be done to integrate these efforts more effectively? And how can government leaders leverage the intersection of open data, open source, and hybrid cloud models to drive improved performance and productivity? Today, I'll explore these questions and so much more with a very special guest, Joel Gurin, co-author of the IBM Center Report, Aligning Open Data, Open Source, and Hybrid Cloud Adoption in Government, and president of the Center for Open Data Enterprise Code. So, Joel, before we delve into your new report for the IBM Center, Aligning Open Data, Open Source, and Hybrid Cloud Adoption in Government, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and the Center for Open Data Enterprise Code, and how did you conduct your research for this report?
Sure, no, I'd be happy to. So I'm the president of the Center for Open Data Enterprise, also known as CODE. We're a nonprofit in Washington, D.C., founded in 2015 with a mission to maximize the value of open and shared data for the public good. So we've been very focused since the beginning on the ways that open data and particularly federal data can be published, shared, and applied in ways that help improve issues such as healthcare, the environment, transparency of federal spending, many, many other issues. And my co-author on this paper, Matt Rumsey, is the research and communications manager at CODE as well. So we're really very passionate about open data. And what we've found as we've worked in this area over the last several years is that you ultimately can't really talk about open data without also talking about open source and the use of the cloud, because they are so interrelated and each is really very important to the success of the others as well. So we got interested in this area because there have been a number of new federal policies that relate to open data, open source, and hybrid cloud adoption, which we'll talk about in a minute. And we were very interested in what could be done to really sync these up and to help align them in ways that would really maximize the benefit of all of these policies in a more integrated way. And we're very, very happy to have the IBM Center interested in working with us to create this report and publish it. So to do our research, we went to the sources. We talked to about 24 people, both in individual interviews and through a roundtable that was hosted and coordinated by the IBM Center for the Business of Government, to really delve into both their views of the federal policies themselves and the relationship between them. We talked to people from industry, we talked to people from the nonprofit sector, a number of people either currently in government or recently in government, and got a lot of great perspectives that we were able to pull together and apply to writing this report.
You mentioned already, Joel, the developments have been acknowledged and formalized via government-wide policy. So what policies are we talking about that are highlighted in your report? The federal cloud computing strategy, cloud strategy, the federal data strategy, the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act, the Evidence Act, as we commonly refer to it as, and the federal source code policy for short. I was wondering, in terms of continuing with definitions, could you tell us a little bit about each policy, why they are so important at advancing the adoption and use of open data, open source, and hybrid cloud models to drive improved performance and productivity, specifically in the government context?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act, and from here on, I'll just call it the Evidence Act for obvious reasons. It saves a lot of syllables. This really has been a landmark piece of legislation. I mean, the way to think about it is open data. Federal agencies have been supposed to release their data as open data since 2013, when the Obama administration established it as an open data policy, but it has really never had the force of law until now. And the Evidence Act is a huge landmark. It really makes open data the law of the land. It gives a kind of a legal structure to data management activities. while at the same time it strengthens privacy protections. Because from the beginning, open data policy has always said that essentially government data should be open by default, but obviously not in ways that cause privacy and security concerns. So figuring out how to balance those, how to manage legitimate privacy issues has been a big question, and the Evidence Act addresses that. The bill was introduced in 2017 and passed by the House. It was passed by the Senate in 2018, became law in January 2019. And one of the really key things about this, I think, is that this is not in any way a partisan bill like the Data Act before it, several years before, which established transparency around federal spending. This act has had tremendous bipartisan support. And I think it's really the fact that it's passed, that it's signed into law, really is an indication of how much unanimity there is in the feeling that government data needs to be open, needs to be usable, and should be used for the public good. Within the Evidence Act, Title II is the Open Government Data Act, and that's the part of the act that provides the definition that I was reading from before. It really lays out a path to ensure that data is machine readable, that it's high quality, and it also does relate in some ways to the source code policy that we'll talk about in a minute. So that's really, I think, of all of these, the Evidence Act is the most formalized, the strongest kind of protection for the sorts of open policies and practices we're talking about here. The federal data strategy, which we can just call the data strategy, is that actually grew out of the president's management agenda in 2018, which established a cross-agency priority goal, a CAP goal, of leveraging data as a strategic asset. And actually, our organization code did a roundtable with the Office of Management and Budget around that time on leveraging data as a strategic asset, so that it really put out there the idea that we had to think about data and government data as a public good, not just for public interest purposes, but also for business purposes. I mean, at that roundtable, we had a number of people from industry who talked about all the ways that they used everything from GPS data and weather data, census data, and so on. So back in 2018, the federal data strategy really recognized the importance of making this kind of data available for all kinds of public and private sector applications. It also, is grounded through the development of action plans. There was one in 2020. We're waiting to see what happens in 2021. But this is really a mechanism within the federal government and across agencies to establish better data practices and better data openness. So that sort of covers the data part of this. When we come to open source, the real point of reference is the federal government's source code policy, which was released in 2016. This is a policy that specifically encourages agencies to share the code that they develop across government, so that as they develop code for their own purposes, they're supposed to share it among other agencies. It also launched a pilot effort in 2016 requiring agencies to release at least 20% of new custom developed code as open source software for 3 years. So this has been, and this has been, open source had been a kind of practice within government since 2010, but the establishment of the source code policy was the first time that agencies were really directed to embrace openness in this way. So it was meant to give guidance to agencies as they thought about whether or not they should acquire custom developed code as opposed to working perhaps with code that had developed within other agencies and been shared across government. And it also very much related to that balance between using open source solutions versus proprietary solutions. It really pushed agencies to consider open source solutions as well and made it easier for them to release code to the public. So there's been a lot of use and evolution of that since 2016. And then finally, when we come to the cloud, our point of reference here is the cloud. Well, it's gone by a few different names, but we can now call it basically the cloud computing strategy. This was published by OMB in 2019, and it really focuses on security, procurement, and workforce as three key areas that drive agency adoption of cloud solutions. Really encourages agencies to leverage the distributed nature of cloud and hybrid and even multi-cloud solutions.
Joel, I was wondering about the shifting to cloud computing. What is the most relevant model for federal government applications? And I think you alluded to it earlier, it's hybrid cloud approach. What are the benefits of going in that direction for agencies?
Sure. Well, the benefits of going towards hybrid cloud solutions really have to do with how do you get the benefits both of public and of private solutions. So we've seen, just to talk for a minute about some of the private solutions for cloud adoption. We're seeing a number of cases now where federal agencies are working collaboratively with private companies to get their data in the cloud and make it more accessible. It has been slow. The GAO recently did a report that showed that even though we've been working on this for about a decade, only a fraction of federal IT systems run in the cloud, and there's been a number of issues, including security, privacy, capacity within agencies, and so on. And there are some issues with FedRAMP as well, which is a standardized approach to security authorization for cloud service offerings. But I think because of some of these issues and some of these concerns about broad cloud adoption and how do you manage that in the real world, a hybrid approach that combines some of the private sector together with public cloud applications seems to be a good way of managing those concerns and providing some flexibility that agencies are finding helpful.
The other side of that question, Joel, is like many agencies have begun to move from legacy systems to the cloud, to a cloud solution, but several challenges, and you may have alluded to them, have kind of impeded that progress. Perhaps you can elaborate on those.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that we find the most is that many agencies will have multiple cloud solutions. And there's a lot of, I don't know if you would call it reinventing the wheel or just kind of a lack of common solutions. But we do see agencies kind of developing some of their own solutions in a siloed kind of way. So there hasn't been as much opportunity for collaborative information sharing and solution development as there could be. We did hear from the people we interviewed, and people at the roundtable talked about how important it is to get the chief data officers involved in these decisions, largely because the Chief Data Officer Council really provides that kind of information sharing forum. The Chief Information Officers Council, also the CIO Council, is another way to do this, because what we're finding is that without better coordination, both within agencies and information sharing across agencies, we're really seeing a lot of expensive cloud systems and missed opportunities. Different programs within an agency may make cloud decisions independently. So most agencies, people told us, have contracts with all the major cloud service providers, but they don't really have a cloud strategy at an enterprise level. So that's a challenge. The fact that a lot of tech personnel within agencies don't have real familiarity and real expertise with cloud solutions. All of these are challenges. And as I mentioned before, FedRAMP requirements are another issue that agencies have to deal with. Cloud.gov is now available as a government managed platform that's intended to help agencies buy, build, and authorize cloud services, intended to help with FedRAMP compliance issues. But in our interviews, we found that a lot of the people we talked to felt that cloud.gov may not be yet delivering the value that it could, or yet being used as widely as it could. So I think we're definitely seeing an awareness of these challenges and an awareness of need for more kind of high-level strategies, both within agencies and across agencies, but it still seems to be a work in progress.
I want to move on to the common issues theme in your report. And, you point out that the cloud strategy, the federal data strategy, Evidence Act, and the source code policy approach, their goals using different methods. And however, the challenges are similar, including security, privacy, and more. But perhaps for our audience, you can sort of introduce some of the common issues across these federal policies that they have to deal with.
Sure, I'd be happy to. And as you know, a lot of our report really focused on trying to do kind of a crosswalk between these policies and seeing where they're already using similar approaches and where there might be better coordination. Security and privacy, which of course are closely linked, although not quite the same thing, but security and privacy are really paramount. All the policies, the two, the Evidence Act, the Federal Data Strategy, source code policy, cloud policy, security and privacy cut across all of those, particularly looking at data security and integrity to manage risk. And we've seen this code our organization has done a lot of work with Health and Human Services. The reason this is becoming so important, and I think, again, this is something that COVID has raised awareness of, is that there is a tremendous value in being able to link data, to use anonymized health data, for example. So it's not like the solution can simply be that anything that has any risk of a privacy breach is just simply kept under lock and key. So this whole question of how to balance risk with benefit and security and privacy is a really important one. Governance, whether it's governance of source code, cloud uses, or data, cuts across these different areas. Workforce, as I was just mentioning around the cloud, every agencies vary tremendously in their capacity to implement some of these policies, and the question of how to deal with that is a cross-cutting issue. Procurement, all of these policies pay at least some attention to procurement. As I mentioned before, the source code policy has a whole kind of decision-making plan for how agencies can decide how to consider open source in their decisions. The cloud strategy has some similar kinds of help for agencies in cloud adoption as well. The use in decision-making is particularly important to both the Evidence Act and the Federal Data Strategy, really a focus on how data can be used in decision-making. But the cloud strategy also addresses the potential for cloud computing to be an important decision-making tool. All the policies talk about the need for better interagency collaboration. The Evidence Act, Data Strategy, and Source Code Policy all talk about the importance of standards, both for data quality, data access, and also for open source software. And all of the policies basically acknowledge that data is a public resource. The ways that it's used and made available are of public interest, and they talk about public value as a major value in all of their work. So we found a lot of cross-cutting themes, I guess I would say, across all of these policies.
So Joel, your report talks about the intersection of cloud and open data and cloud and open source. So I was wondering if you could share with us the importance of this intersection and perhaps offer us some examples of where you're seeing the intersection of cloud and open data or cloud and open source.
Sure. We looked in our report at how cloud relates to open data, how open data relates to open source, how cloud relates to open source. And I think the short form, as you wouldn't be surprised to hear, is that they really are closely interrelated. I think cloud and open data, I think the major point here is that the cloud is becoming more and more almost an essential vehicle for open data, particularly when we're talking about big data and very large data sets that have to be computable in the cloud. So we're seeing much more of a kind of intersection there. Cloud and open source, in many ways, open source can help increase agency flexibility around cloud solutions. And open source and open data, again, open source in many ways can be kind of a facilitator for open data in a number of ways that we talk about in the report. And one that I mentioned earlier is just simply the use of open source to develop data.gov, which is the kind of core open data repository for the federal government. So we're seeing these, not only are there similarities among the policies in the ways that we just reviewed, but we're seeing some real intersections where they facilitate the principles of cloud adoption, open source, and open data really enhance each other in some very specific ways.
That's great. So one of the things your report does, Joel, is offer some really salient recommendations. And I'd like for you to take some time to talk about the high-level recommendations for operating principles. What are they?
Sure. So this is really based, again, on what we heard from about 24 real experts who relate to these issues in different ways, from in government and outside of government. And we boiled it down to 5, and these really are quite high level, but we think they're very important operating principles. The first is to maintain flexibility. There are not going to be one-size-fits-all approaches to solve all of these. Agencies are very different in their needs and their capacities in the content of what they do. So at the same time that there's a real emphasis on information sharing and best practices, there also has to be a recognition that agencies are different and that they maintain flexibility in how they implement. Second one is sharing success stories. We think there could be tremendous value in agencies sharing much more information about the solutions that they've found for open source, open data, and cloud adoption. And I think there's a lot of progress that could be made rapidly in that kind of way. Building the workforce, we talked about a lot. But we think that there really could be some specific things to be done to encourage training or reskilling efforts for current employees. Even something like adding a data science job series to the general schedule classification and pay system could be helpful. So, beyond saying, as these policies already do, that you need to train and improve your workforce, more steps to be taken to really facilitate how that can be done. Building the workforce is a major recommendation. Fourth is applying user-driven approaches. I mentioned some of the work that our organization has done in really trying to facilitate feedback from data users to data providers in similar kinds of ways. Customer orientation towards how is this software solution working? How is this cloud service, cloud adoption approach to federal data working? We think there really have to be very, very robust feedback loops and also user-driven approaches from the very beginning, if possible. And then finally, the fifth one, which we've also touched on, is learning from the pandemic. That I think, cloud adoption clearly is critical, as we are likely to stay in a situation that includes continued remote work. And I think also just on the issue of data itself, everything that we've learned from the pandemic about the need to share scientific data and ways to share, in some cases, sensitive health data, but for the public good, there's a lot of lessons to be learned there that we think should be baked into ongoing operating principles.
Joel, going from the operating principles to, recommended actions, perhaps you could highlight some of the key recommended actions you outline in your report that the current administration can pursue.
Yes, we go into a lot of detail here, and I would encourage and hope people to read the report itself because we do think these recommendations are important. But I'll just go through each of them briefly. First is to fund the implementation of the Evidence Act. As I mentioned before, the act was passed really without appropriations. Resources are a critical need. We think this funding is necessary. The Data Coalition, one of our colleagues in the nonprofit data world, have called for $2 million for each CFO Act agency. And we do think that whether it's that order of magnitude or something similar, funding is essential here. We've talked about building the workforce. We recommend leveraging and building on the Talent Act, the Tested Ability to Leverage Exceptional National Talent Act that was signed into law by President Obama to build a data literate and cloud literate workforce. We think there's third recommendation. We think there's an interesting opportunity to provide vouchers for researchers, nonprofits, and others to use cloud resources for research analysis and policy making. And we've seen some moves in this direction, for example, by the NIH, that we think are very promising and really could help improve cloud adoption and utilization. Fourth recommendation is to update the source code policy to encourage government use of existing robust open source products and further engagement with the open source communities, even though open source community engagement is part of the policy. But the policy is largely focused on agencies producing their own code in ways that can then be shared with other agencies and even with the public in an open source basis. We think there may be a lot of opportunities to use existing open source solutions that could be explored more. Next recommendation is to update the key federal data policies to better align them and fill some gaps. All of these policies, as we've said, really could be better aligned, even though they do tend to focus on some similar areas already. We think there's an opportunity in the data part of this to leverage agency data inventories to understand agency data systems better. The Evidence Act requires data inventories. We think that these are useful not only in showing the data is there, but as a tool to understanding how the whole system is working. And then finally, we think it may be very valuable, based on our experience, to develop a plain language toolkit to explain how these policies intersect, what they mean for agencies, and how to implement them in ways that really build strength across these three areas of data, open source, and cloud adoption.
This has been a special edition of the Business of Government Hour, a conversation with authors, exploring ideas for improving government effectiveness with Joel Gurin, co-author of the IBM Center Report, aligning open data, open source, and hybrid cloud adoption in government, and the president of the Center for Open Data Enterprise Code. Subscribe, download, and listen to the entire interview at Podcast One, iTunes, or on your favorite podcast app, and as always at businessofgovernment.org.